Picture this. The year is 1934, and you live in the small country of Andorra, situated in a quaint valley in the Pyrenees between Spain and France. For centuries, your country has been ruled by foreign princes, and while reform has come to the larger nations of Western Europe, bringing them democracy and freedom, Andorra has seemingly been stuck in the medieval era. The general feeling in the country is one of unease. No more than a year earlier, a group of young peasants, your contemporaries, seized the capital in an attempt to institute democracy by force, only to be thrown out violently. Still, the ideas of the revolution of 1933 linger in the collective consciousness of the people around you. It seems as if change is in the air. No sooner do you get this feeling than when you begin hearing whispers of a strange man leading a campaign across your humble nation. He is dignified and intelligent, and carries with him an aura of nobility that demands respect. He plans to be Andorra's next leader, and he promises great reforms that will take your nation from a backwater microstate under the illegitimate heels of Spanish and French imperialism to a rich and free bastion of liberal democracy, complete with low taxes and open trade to attract foreign investment, finally bringing Andorra into the modern era. His plan seems promising, and he has a palpable charm about him, but something seems off about all of this. The truth, you will come to learn, is that this is not just another upstart Andorran revolutionary seeking to bring change to his home, but the Russian conman and international swindler Boris Skossyreff, and his play for the Andorran crown is just the latest in a long list of schemes he's enacted in the past few decades all across Europe. Though he will finally achieve his dreams of royalty in this small principality, it will all come crashing down for him in spectacular fashion a mere 13 days later. Boris Skossyreff is a criminally under-discussed figure in European history. The only reason I even started reading about him in the first place was because he was mentioned in a very brief aside in a paper about general Andorran history, which is a shame because he's also by far one of the most interesting characters in early 20th century Europe. Boris was born on June 12, 1896 in Vilna, then part of the Russian Empire, now known as Vilnius, Lithuania. His ethnicity is not exactly clear. Most sources list him as Russian, but I've also seen Belarusian, Lithuanian, Polish, and even Jewish. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be calling him Russian, but let the lack of clarity be a testament as to just how difficult it is to get reliable information on this historical figure, for reasons that will soon become clear. Boris was born to a presumably wealthy merchant family, certainly of a higher class than most Russian peasants. His father, Mikhail Skossyreff, was a merchant belonging to the First Guild of the Russian Empire, a status which granted him a great number of privileges, but which carried no title that he would be able to pass on to his son, a fact which Boris would later seek to rectify. His father's status would have allowed Boris to experience a comfortable life, in which he wanted for little and enjoyed a sense of superiority over others due to his heritage. He was likely well educated, learning multiple languages and becoming experienced in navigating social situations, two skills which would come to help him greatly later in life. Unfortunately for him, Skossyreff's life of comfort and prestige came crashing down in August of 1914. He was only 18 years old when the Germans invaded Russia during World War I. During this period, several of the other Allied powers sent expeditionary forces to Russia in order to help fend off the Germans, and later, the Soviets. Boris found work with one such expeditionary force when he volunteered with the British RNAS Armoured Squadron as a military translator, a battalion which was headed by one Oliver Locker-Lampson, a man of some prestige who would later go on to become a member of the British Parliament. Boris developed a close relationship with Locker-Lampson, a connection that would eventually come in very handy for the young Russian aristocrat. In 1917, the Russian Revolution broke out, and knowing that a man of his status in history wouldn't be treated kindly by the Bolsheviks, Boris Skossyreff fled to London, where he served formally in the British military for about 2 years. It is during this period of his life that Boris's scheming truly begins, as well as his tendency to break the law. He is cited in a number of newspapers for a series of petty crimes during his tenure with the British military, including several accounts of check fraud and an attempt to steal a golden watch. Predictably, he ends up in trouble with the law for this in 1919, when he was arrested for the first time and put on trial for both the aforementioned crimes, as well as for failing to properly register his address as a foreigner. During this trial, Boris decided to bring up some anecdotes about his time in Russia that he thought might garner him some sympathy from the British court. How exactly these remarks had anything to do with the crimes he was being charged with, I'm not quite sure, but I digress. To be honest, I struggle to consider his account trustworthy. Boris had every motivation to exaggerate and lie, and doing so would have little repercussion, as it would have been impossible to verify what he was saying. That being said, while on trial, he claimed to have been imprisoned by the Bolsheviks, who supposedly murdered some members of his family. This story about Bolshevik brutality very well may have been true, but we have no evidence to back it up other than Skossyreff's own words, which, as previously stated, may not exactly be reliable. You'll come to see why in more detail as the video progresses. Regardless of the accuracy of his testimony, Boris managed to get off with just a fine. This fine was paid off by a third party, the identity of which is not public knowledge. Feel free to let your imagination run wild as to who exactly that could have been. In 1924, while still living in Britain, Boris reached out to Oliver Locker-Lamson, his old commander from his time in the British Expeditionary Force. Boris had Locker-Lamson write something of a letter of recommendation about him, detailing Boris's exceptional service to the Allied forces during their time at war together. With Locker-Lamson being a politician of some renown at this point, it's needless to say that his glowing report opened up many doors for Skossyreff. Indeed, one of these doors may have led directly into work with the British Secret Service. Now, there's no hard evidence that it did, but it's not a terribly difficult leap in logic to make. He already had ties to the British government, was a man of unmatched charisma, spoke a plethora of languages, had a knack for deception, and now had the backing of a prestigious MP. It's not hard at all to imagine that his particular set of skills might have come in handy for the good old MI6. That being said, I'll be the first to admit that this claim is somewhat conspiratorial. While most sources seem to agree that Skossyreff worked for the British government in some capacity, it seems much more likely that he worked for the Foreign Office, or a similar agency, rather than being a fully fledged secret agent. In any case, Skossyreff's movements across Europe and the globe become incredibly difficult to track and are very poorly documented for about the next decade following Locker-Lamson's letter. Regardless of whether his shenanigans were state-sponsored or not, though, Boris was certainly about to get into some foreign meddling. Boris left the UK soon after, first going to the Netherlands, then traveling all across the continent. While doing so, he carried around a Dutch passport, which was actually preserved to this day, and it's a great thing it was, because that means we get to analyze it. First of all, it confirms certain basic facts about Skossyreff, such as his full name and date of birth. Interestingly, however, it wasn't issued in the Netherlands itself, but rather at the Dutch consulate in Dijon, France, and lists the year as November 8th, 1923. I find this date incredibly suspicious, because by my count, Boris was still in the UK until at least the year after this passport was supposedly issued. This brings further into question how he even managed to obtain a Dutch passport, having never lived in the Netherlands by that point, let alone managed to obtain the citizenship that would have been required to legally obtain it. Some level of trickery was at play here, undoubtedly. Nevertheless, with the knowledge that it was likely a forgery of some kind, the passport goes on to list a few more, shall we say, interesting facts about Boris. It gives him a noble title, for one, Monsieur le Baron Boris de Skossyreff. Pretending to be a noble will become a running theme in Boris's life, you'll soon come to see. The passport goes on to list his occupation as journalist, which is certainly one way to describe Monsieur Skossyreff's line of work, and says that he will be traveling to France and Spain. That last part at least is true, but it's far from an exhaustive list of all the places he went during this period of his life. Boris went on to acquire a Nansen passport for stateless persons in 1925 and proceeded to go on a series of miscellaneous escapades across Europe for a period of about the next 12 years. It is during this period that Boris began to create something of an undercover persona for himself. That is to say, he crafted a web of lies to make himself appear much more important and influential than he actually was. As he traveled from place to place, he made false claims about having studied at Oxford University and France's prestigious Lycée Louis le Grand, and of having a childhood friendship with the Prince of Wales. He even claimed to have served in the Dutch Queen Wilhelmina's royal court, for which he was supposedly granted the non-existent title Count of Orange, Orange being the name of the Dutch royal family itself. As funny as I find the idea of this Russian immigrant being Dutch royalty, the government of the Netherlands didn't seem to agree, granting him the very real title International Swindler, a label so befitting that it's cited in the very first sentence on Boris's Wikipedia page. This prestigious honor was granted to him when he appeared on the Dutch Central Intelligence Service's list of prominent foreign revolutionaries. At some point between all of his international swindling, Skossyreff found time for love. In 1931, he married a Frenchwoman by the name of Marie-Louise Perrot de Gassier. It seems likely to me that this marriage was mostly intended as a way for him to obtain French citizenship, though, because he applied for it not long after, only to be denied. If he needed further evidence that this marriage was one of convenience rather than true love, Boris had an affair just 1 year later with a young Englishwoman named Polly Hurd, and then became romantically involved with yet another woman that same year. This third lover of his was Florence Marmon, an American millionairess, ex-wife of a wealthy motor company CEO, and thereby a very wealthy woman herself. It's likely that Florence played a role in financing Boris's adventures to some degree, and may have even accompanied him on some of them. Alright, I promise we'll get to the Andorra thing soon, but before that I want to tie up a couple loose ends I discovered in my research. I was able to find a Foreign Office document detailing a minor argument between Boris and a high-ranking Japanese military officer. Whether this quarrel occurred during Boris's time working for the British government or during his service in World War I is unclear, but it just goes to show that this man was willing to pick a fight with just about anyone in a position of authority. There's also a record indicating that he registered a company in Santa Maria, Colombia, of all places, titled Boris Skossyreff Import-Export Representation in 1932. This, quite frankly, makes no sense to me. He has no Colombian markings on any of his passports, and there are no other records of Skossyreff ever being in Colombia, let alone running a trade company there. This is just one of those details about this man's life that I as an individual simply don't have the time or energy to look any further into, at least not without going insane. So now we finally return to the setting established at the beginning of the video. In 1934, Andorra was in political turmoil. Just a year earlier, the Revolution of 1933, started by peasants unhappy with the pseudo-feudal system in place at the time, left the political and economic situations unstable. The country was run in part by an elected parliament called the General Council of the Valleys, but they shared power with two unelected foreign co-princes who had historical claims to the Andorran land: the Catholic bishop of the Spanish county of Urgell and the president of France, who inherited the title through a long line of circumstances dating back over 1,000 years. At the same time, waves of political change were happening all across Europe, from the Russian Revolution to the fascist takeovers in Italy and Germany, and Spain wasn't far behind. The winds of change were very much in the air. This was the environment into which Boris Skossyreff entered on that fateful day in early May. Truly, the Andorran adventure was the culmination of all of Boris's lies and schemes up to that point. When he came to the microstate, he wasn't some Russian exile with a criminal record. He was the noble Count of Orange, Monsieur le Baron Boris de Skossyreff. He was a suave, handsome, rich man with an Oxford education. I mean, just look at that signature monocle and cane. How could you possibly not trust him? He led a campaign all across the country, which didn't take very long on account of its small size, in which he made common cause with peasants and politicians alike. He presented a solid plan. If he had his way, he'd make Andorra into an ultra-liberal tax haven, not unlike the reforms that other small European states like Monaco and Luxembourg were undergoing. He'd bring foreign investment into the country, lifting it out of its feudal-style economy, and on top of that, he'd institute democratic reforms to bring the voice of the people further into the government, accompanied by freedoms of religion, speech, and the press. All of this was presented in a new constitution, which he printed numerous copies of. And what did he ask in return for all of these wonderful reforms? Only to be made king of the country. Now, you may be asking, what claim could this Russian immigrant, who was only visiting Andorra for the first time in his life, possibly have to its throne? Well, Skossyreff actually took out the time to make a reasoned claim, which he presented to the people in order to give legitimacy to his power play. You see, as previously established, Andorra's two co-princes at the time were the President of France and the Catholic Bishop of Urgell, but this had not always been the case. Though the title of Prince of Andorra had been held in full or in part by the Bishop of Urgell since the year 988, who exactly the second co-prince was changed throughout the years, being passed from title to title. In 1095 it was the Lord of Cabouet. In 1278 it was the Count of Foix. After the unification of France under a single monarch, the French king inherited the title of co-prince of Andorra. Then, finally, in 1799, the French Revolution brought down the monarchy, and it was agreed that the head of state of France, regardless of their official title, be it king, president, or emperor, would hold the title of co-prince. It was this passing along of the princeship from king to president that Boris contended with. The way he saw it, the agreement was that the King of France would hold the title, and that did not suddenly become null and void once the king stopped holding power. Therefore, he claimed that the true inheritor of the Andorran crown was Prince Jean d'Orléans, Duke of Guise, and pretender to the French throne. So then, where does our good friend Boris fit into this story? Well, according to him, Prince John had very generously ceded his claim to the Andorran throne to the House of Skossyreff, and backed Boris's right to rule. In reality, there was no evidence that the Duke of Guise even knew about what was going on in Andorra, or had ever contacted Boris, let alone backing his claim to the throne. Additionally, regardless of the legitimacy of the French president's co-princeship, it would be impossible to argue against the historicity of the Bishop of Urgell's rule. This fact Boris tactfully decided not to touch on for the time being. Nevertheless, that was the reasoned claim, held together exclusively by duct tape and assumptions, which Boris Skossyreff presented to the Andorran nation. And as ridiculous as you or I may find it, it was apparently enough for him to garner a great amount of support. Look, apparently he even still has supporters to this day, found exclusively in the darkest depths of the brain cell depleting cesspool that is r/monarchism. Truly, monarchists will support anything so long as it's corrupt. Regardless, with enough support from the populace gained to fuel Boris's confidence, he presented his claim to the throne and his plan for the nation to the General Council of the Valleys. While they deliberated, surprisingly not rejecting him outright, news of the ongoings in Andorra reached the outside world. On May 22nd, Spanish and French authorities, unsurprisingly, ordered the immediate expulsion of Boris Skossyreff from the nation. Choosing to pick his battles, he complied, and left for the small Spanish town of La Seu d'Urgell, just a couple miles south of the Andorran border. But this minor setback did not stop Boris's plans. No, he continued to build support and petition the Andorran government remotely from his hotel in Urgell. He took to running what can only accurately be described as a PR campaign. He held numerous telephone interviews with Andorran and Spanish publications, printed pamphlets and posters to be distributed in Andorra, including his proposed constitution, which now curiously included a provision prohibiting the expulsion of Andorrans and foreigners from the country, and in all ways began acting the part of an exiled monarch. He painted a picture of the Spanish and French as illegitimate despots trying to prevent Andorra from reaching its true glory, which, of course, he reasoned, could only be achieved under the rule of a different foreign power, himself. This campaign of his lasted for over a month, and amazingly, it worked. On July 7th, Boris formally proposed his plan to the General Council of the Valleys. On July 8th, they responded. The vote was 23-1 in favor of his proposal. Boris was officially crowned His Most Serene Highness Boris I, Prince of the Valleys of Andorra, Lieutenant of His Majesty the King of France, Defender of the Faith. Yes, I'm serious. That title may sound like a mouthful, but in all fairness, it's pretty short by monarch standards. The General Council reaffirmed their vote 2 days later on July 10th, with the exact same result, 23-1. Both times, the single dissenting vote was the representative from the town of Encamp. This representative very quickly went to inform the Bishop of Urgell, Justi Guitart y Vilardebo, that his power over Andorra had just been taken away by an upstart supposed noble who had only first arrived in the country a little over a month ago. Suffice it to say that Bishop Vilardebo was not happy. While the president of France, Albert Lebrun, was seemingly happy to renounce his claim to Andorra, presumably having better things to worry about, such as the rising threat in the east, the bishop made clear that he would not agree to any transfer of power, and would not tolerate Skossyreff's actions. For his part, His Most Serene Highness Boris I responded in kind by issuing a declaration of war on the Bishop of Urgell on July 12th, just 4 days after being voted into the throne. What followed was a brutal conflict lasting several years, in which tens of thousands of people lost their lives, and I'm just kidding. Neither Boris nor Bishop Vilardebo had any army to speak of, but what the bishop had, that Boris did not, was support from the Spanish government. On the 20th of July, Vilardebo arrived in Andorra, accompanied by several members of the Guardia Civil, the Spanish gendarmerie force, who arrested Skossyreff on account of breaching the order of expulsion which was previously brought against him. Yeah, it turns out that including that tidbit about it being illegal to expel foreigners in its constitution didn't mean much when there was no loyal army or police force to enforce it. And now at long last, we exit the climax and reach the falling action of Boris Skossyreff's life story. Though his play for power was ultimately unsuccessful, it did permanently alter Andorran history, and I'm sure it made for one hell of a story to tell. Boris was first taken into custody in Barcelona, before being transferred to a prison in Madrid 3 days later. During this time, he was interviewed by a number of journalists, to whom he recounted the events of what had happened and reasserted his claim to the Andorran throne. In addition to his prison overalls, he was still wearing his signature monocle over his right eye, and one journalist of the New York Times remarked that he had a royal dignity about him, and preserved an air of distinction, even while in jail. Boris provided to multiple reporters a grand historic record of the lineage of the Andorran throne, once again asserting that it truly belonged to the Duke of Guise. When asked whether he himself was descended from the Duke, Boris admitted with some hesitation to one reporter that he was not, but rather that his claim to the throne was based on the principles of chivalry and a desire to liberate Andorrans out from under the heels of Spanish and French imperialism. It's truly these little anecdotes about this man that fascinate me so much. The utter gall to say these things with a straight face after such a spectacular failure is truly astounding. Boris was transferred to a prison in Portugal in November of 1934, months after his initial internment. By the end of 1935, he was finally released from prison, and he went back to St. Cannot, France, to live with his wife, Marie-Louise. His other lovers, Polly Hurt and Florence Marmon, he reportedly never spoke to again. This would be a lovely end to his story, but it would be very unlike Boris to give up his life of shenaniganry at such a young age as 40. No, Boris was predictably arrested once again on February 9th, 1937, for unknown reasons. Because he never did end up acquiring French citizenship, he was placed in an internment camp for foreigners in the south of France near Mende. Then, in May of 1939, he was moved to the Vernet concentration camp. Just a year later, France was invaded and conquered by Nazi Germany, and Vernet was taken over by the Vichy government. If you thought this was an unfortunate turn of events for Boris, though, you'd be sorely mistaken. Seeing his mastery of multiple languages and his military experience, Skossyreff was released from internment in exchange for service as a military translator for the Wehrmacht. Eventually, he even reached the rank of commander. So, just to make sure we're all on the same page, Boris Skossyreff went from being a Russian white émigré to possibly a British secret agent, to the pretender to the throne of Andorra, to an inmate in a French prison, and now to a Nazi military commander. That's one hell of a life. He was captured by the Americans in 1945, and was subsequently released after they realized that he was, indeed, not a German. After World War II, he settled in Boppard, West Germany. He wasn't quite done yet, though, because he was arrested once again in Eisenach, a town in Soviet-occupied Eastern Germany, again for unknown reasons, though it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that he was smuggling goods across borders. This time, though, Boris would not be getting off easy. He was sentenced to internment in Siberia for an indefinite amount of time, being released 8 years later. He was eventually allowed to resettle in Boppard, where he finally decided to rest, perhaps having learned his lesson from the almost decade of forced labor in the frigid Siberian cold. When he got back from the Gulag, Boris was 60 years old, and he lived a quiet life in Germany until his death at age 92 on the 27th of February 1989. His birth date was mistakenly listed as 1900 on his gravestone because German authorities didn't have reliable information about him, forcing them to use a placeholder date. All in all, Boris Skossyreff was many things. A criminal, a soldier, an international swindler, an adventurer, and, very briefly, a king. It's hard to say that his story has any kind of moral other than maybe stay out of trouble with the law and, if you're going to overthrow a government, at least build up an army first. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed learning about this enigmatic historical figure as much as I did. If you did enjoy it, I strongly encourage you to like this video and subscribe so I can continue to make this kind of content, as this is my first video on this channel. And if you're watching this in the future and want to see more, feel free to click on any of the suggested videos on your screen that YouTube thinks you'll like. Until next time, class is adjourned.